There is a story told in the Highlands, in the kind of village where the fog never fully lifts before noon, and where old women still cross themselves when the wind changes direction without warning. It is a story about faith, about hunger, and about the terrible price of being saved by the wrong hands. Some say it is just a folktale, passed down to frighten children into obedience. Others say every word of it is true, and that the well at the center of the old village square still remembers. Judge for yourself. This is the story of Asheville Hollow and the priestess who came to heal it. The Hollow was a small village, tucked between two mountains that blocked out the morning sun until almost 10 o'clock. The people there were farmers and weavers, simple folk who prayed to the old gods of harvest and rain, and who had never known much suffering beyond bad winters and the occasional fever. That changed the autumn the sickness came. It began with the Caro family. The father, a broad-shouldered miller named Tom Caro, woke one morning unable to feel his fingers. By nightfall, black veins had crawled up his arms like ivy made of shadow. He died screaming 3 days later, clawing at his own throat as though something inside him were trying to get out. His wife buried him, and within a week, she too bore the same black veins. Then his children. Then the neighbors who had helped dig the grave. The village elder, a proud and aging man named Bartholomew Greaves, sent for healers from every town within 3 days' ride. None could explain it. None could stop it. The sickness did not care for age or strength. It took the young mother nursing her infant. It took the blacksmith's apprentice, a boy of only 12. By the time the first frost came, Asheville Hollow had buried 43 of its own, and the graveyard, once a quiet corner behind the chapel, had to be expanded twice. It was in this season of grief that the priestess arrived. She came on foot, alone, wrapped in a cloak the color of dried blood, with eyes so pale they seemed to hold no color at all. She called herself Sister Marin, though she carried no holy symbols the villagers recognized, and she spoke with an accent none of them could place. She walked into the village square as though she had been summoned, though no one had sent for her, and she said only this: "I have come because you are dying, and because I can stop it." Desperate people do not ask many questions of the ones who offer them hope. Bartholomew Greaves, his own granddaughter already showing the first black thread along her wrist, welcomed Sister Marin into his home that very night. And by morning, the girl's veins had cleared. She sat up in bed, color in her cheeks, asking for porridge as though she had simply had a long nap. Word spread through the hollow like fire through dry wheat. The priestess healed the next family and the next. She would kneel beside the sick, press her palms against their chests, and murmur words in a language that was not quite Latin and not quite anything else, and the black veins would recede like tide pulling back from the shore. Some villagers wept with relief. Others whispered that she must be touched by the old gods themselves, sent to save them in their darkest hour. Within a month, the dying stopped almost entirely. Within 2, Asheville Hollow had begun to believe it might survive after all. But healing is never free. Not truly. Not in stories like this one. What the villagers did not know, what only Sister Marin knew, alone in the dark of whatever room she slept in, was the truth of where the sickness had come from in the first place. Because Sister Marin had not arrived to save Asheville Hollow from a plague. She had arrived to save it from herself. You see, decades before, in a village far from these mountains, a younger woman named Marin had practiced a different kind of faith. Not healing, not yet. She had been a seeker of power, the kind of power that does not come from gods who love you but from older things, things that live beneath the soil and remember when the world was young and cruel. She had made a pact with one such thing, a being the old texts called only the Hollow Mother, a presence that fed not on blood, but on suffering itself. In exchange for abilities beyond mortal healers, abilities to mend bone with a touch and pull fever from a body like drawing poison from a wound, Marin had agreed to a single condition. Wherever she settled, wherever she made her home and built her reputation as a healer, the Hollow Mother would feed. Quietly. Slowly. A village's worth of suffering, harvested over a season, so that Marin's gift could exist at all. She had not understood, not fully, what she was agreeing to, until the first village she settled in began to sicken. She watched, horrified, As family she had grown to love withered with the same black-veined illness that now haunted Asheville Hollow. And when she finally understood the shape of her bargain, that the illness arrived because of her, that her very presence was the seed of the suffering she would later be praised for curing, it was already too late to undo it. She fled in the night, certain she had doomed an entire village to a slow and pointless death. She told herself she would never make that mistake again, but the Hollow Mother does not release what it has claimed. Every few years, wherever Marin traveled, the sickness found her. It would creep into whatever village welcomed her, feed on the suffering of the innocent, and then, once it had taken its toll, allow her healing gift to work its cure on the survivors. She was not the rescuer. She was the disease's herald, dressed in the rescuer's clothing. And the longer she lived with this knowledge, the more she told herself a terrible, comforting lie, that since she could not stop the sickness from coming, the kindest thing she could do was follow behind it and heal what remained. That some suffering was simply the cost of her continued existence, and that the dead would have died anyway somewhere to someone. This was Sister Marin's secret. This was the dark truth she carried into Asheville Hollow, smiling gently as she pressed her palms against dying children, knowing in some buried chamber of her heart that she herself was the reason those children had ever needed saving at all now. Every story needs its serpent in the garden, and Asheville Hollow's serpent was not the priestess alone. It was Bartholomew Greaves. The village elder had welcomed Sister Marin as a savior, yes, but Bartholomew was not a simple man of faith. He was a man who understood power, and who had spent 30 years clawing his way to the top of a village too small to satisfy his ambitions. He watched the way the people looked at Sister Marin, the way they began bringing her offerings of grain and silver, and gratitude that once would have gone to the chapel, to him. And rather than feeling humbled by her gift, Bartholomew felt something colder stir in his chest. Opportunity. He began visiting her in private late at night under the pretense of discussing the village's welfare. He asked careful questions. How did her healing work? Where had she learned it? Whether such a gift could be taught, or sold, or in some fashion controlled. Sister Marin, lonely after decades of solitude and starved for even the illusion of companionship, made the mistake every guarded soul eventually makes. She let herself be flattered. She let herself believe that perhaps, finally, someone saw her as more than a tool for survival. One night, 3 months into her stay, she told him almost everything. Not the full truth, not the name of the Hollow Mother nor the exact nature of her bargain, but enough. She told him that her healing came at a cost, that the illness was tied to her presence, and that she lived in constant terror that someone would discover the cruel arithmetic of her gift. She told him this in tears, believing she was finally unburdening herself to a friend. Bartholomew did not comfort her. He sat in silence for a long moment and then he smiled, because Bartholomew Greaves did not hear a confession of guilt. He heard a business opportunity. If Sister Marin's presence brought sickness and her gift cured it, then a man clever enough to control her movements could, in theory, control the fates of entire villages. He could sell her healing to neighboring towns for fortunes in gold. He could let villages sicken just enough to grow desperate, then arrive with the cure already in hand, charging whatever price desperation would bear. He saw, in Sister Marin's tearful confession, the architecture of an empire built on other people's suffering. He began, in secret, corresponding with merchants and minor lords in neighboring territories, hinting at a miracle healer he could provide, for the right price. He never told Sister Marin what he intended. He simply waited, gathering gold, gathering promises, gathering power, all while continuing to praise her publicly as the village's salvation. The greed in his heart grew quietly, the way mold grows in the dark, unnoticed until the whole house smells of rot. Meanwhile, in the village itself, the people of Asheville Hollow were not as oblivious as Bartholomew assumed. A young woman named Etta, who had lost her younger brother to the very first wave of the sickness before Sister Marin's arrival, had never quite trusted the priestess's perfect timing. Etta had a sharp mind and a sharper grief, and grief, when it does not consume a person, often sharpens them into something dangerous to liars. She began watching Sister Marin. She noticed that the priestess never seemed to age, despite claiming decades of travel. She noticed that Sister Maren flinched whenever anyone asked where she had lived before, as though the question itself caused her pain. And she noticed, most damning of all, that the sickness in Asheville Hollow had begun, according to old Widow Hask's recollection, on almost the exact same week strange rumors first placed a cloaked traveler on the mountain road. Etta began asking questions in the village. Quiet questions, careful ones, the kind that travel slower than gossip but cut deeper. And slowly, she found others who remembered the same strange traveler. A boy who had seen a woman matching Sister Maren's description camped near the old well a full week before her official arrival in the square. A woman who recalled a cloak the color of dried blood disappearing into the tree line the very night Tom Caro first fell ill. The pieces, once gathered, formed a shape too terrible to ignore. Etta brought her findings to Bartholomew Greaves, expecting him to share her horror, expecting the village elder to protect his people from a deception this monstrous. What she did not know was that Bartholomew already understood far more than she did, and that he had no intention of losing his golden goose to a village mob before he had finished negotiating her sale to the highest bidder. He did the unthinkable. He betrayed Etta's trust completely. That very night, he went to Sister Maren and told her with feigned concern that a young woman in the village suspected her secret and was stirring unrest. He framed it as a warning, as an act of loyalty, when in truth it was nothing more than damage control for his own ambitions. He needed Sister Maren calm, cooperative, and unaware that her usefulness to him was the only reason he had not already exposed her to a village that would have torn her apart with their bare hands. Sister Maren, terrified, did something she had not done in any of the villages before this one. She went to Etta herself. She found the young woman alone at her brother's grave, the small wooden marker weathered from a season of grief, and she knelt beside her in the cold grass. And there, finally, decades of guilt broke loose from wherever Sister Maren had been holding it. She told Etta everything. The pact, the Hollow Mother. The terrible cycle of arriving, watching villages sicken, and healing what remained, telling herself it was mercy when it had always been a continuation of the very curse she carried. Etta listened in silence, her brother's grave cold beneath her knees, and when Sister Maren finished, Etta did not scream, did not strike her, did not run for the village. She simply asked one question. If you stopped, if you left now and never healed anyone again, would the sickness stop coming? And Sister Maren, for the first time in her long and guilty life, did not know the answer, because she had never once tried. This, dear listener, is where the story turns its sharpest corner, the place where betrayal folds in on itself and becomes something almost unbearable to witness. Bartholomew Greaves, having already sold word of his miracle healer to a lord 3 valleys over, could not allow Sister Maren to simply leave. His fortune, his power, the entire architecture of greed he had spent months constructing, depended on her remaining exactly where she was, healing exactly as she had been healing, for exactly as long as it took him to extract every coin of value from her existence. So when his spies in the village informed him that Sister Maren and Etta had been seen together at the graveyard, speaking in hushed and urgent tones, he understood that his carefully built scheme was unraveling. He made his move that very night. He gathered a handful of men he had quietly bribed with promises of future wealth, men desperate enough in their own right to ask few questions, and he told them a story far simpler and far more flattering to himself than the truth. He told them that Sister Maren was a witch who had brought the sickness upon them deliberately, that she fed on their suffering for sport, and that she now intended to flee the village with Etta as her accomplice, having stolen secrets and silver from the chapel coffers. It was, of course, a lie built from true bones, twisted just enough to make Bartholomew the hero and himself the only man brave enough to act. The men came for Sister Maren in the dark hours before dawn. They dragged her from the small cottage at the village's edge, and when Etta tried to intervene, tried to tell them the truth, that Bartholomew himself had known everything for months and had done nothing, the men did not listen. Grief and fear make poor audiences for nuance. They bound them both and brought them to the village square. The very place where Sister Maren had first offered her healing months before, now transformed into something closer to an execution ground. Bartholomew stood before the gathered crowd, his face arranged into perfect sorrow, and he told them that he, their elder, had only just discovered the priestess's true nature, that he had been deceived as they all had, and that justice demanded action before she could curse them further or escape to bring her plague upon some other unsuspecting village. The crowd, exhausted by months of grief and terror, found in his words a target for everything they had suffered. It is a terrible thing, how easily a frightened people will hand their judgment to the loudest voice in the room, especially when that voice tells them their suffering was someone else's fault entirely, and never their own elder's greed. They built a pyre in the square that had once held the promise of salvation. Sister Maren, bound and bleeding from where the ropes had cut her wrists, found Eda's eyes across the crowd, and in that final exchanged look, something passed between them that no one else in the square understood. An apology, a confession, perhaps even a strange and terrible gratitude that after decades of carrying her secret alone, someone finally knew the whole, unbearable truth of her and had not run. As the flames began to climb, Sister Maren did not scream the way the villagers expected a witch to scream. She closed her eyes and began to speak, low and steady, in that same not-quite language she had used to heal so many of their children. The crowd faltered, uncertain, as the words grew louder, as the very air around the pyre seemed to thicken and darken, the torchlight bending strangely, the temperature dropping despite the fire's heat. And then just as suddenly she stopped. The fire consumed her. And for one suspended moment, Asheville Hollow stood in terrible silence, believing the nightmare finally over. It was not. Within 3 days, the black veins returned. Not slowly, not selectively, but all at once, sweeping through the village like a wave that had only ever been held back by a single trembling hand. Bartholomew Greaves himself was among the first to fall, the veins crawling up his throat as he choked on whatever final justification he had been preparing. Because Sister Maren's healing had never been separate from the sickness. It had been the only thing standing between the village and the Hollow Mother's true appetite. In killing her, they had not freed themselves from her curse. They had simply removed the only person capable of holding it at bay and unleashed it in its purest, most ravenous form. Eda, spared somehow, whether by the dying priestess's final words or by some small mercy in a story with very few mercies left, watched her village die in earnest over the following weeks. Asheville Hollow was abandoned by midwinter, its survivors scattering to towns that would later whisper about the place where everyone had simply vanished. The chapel crumbled. The well in the square, the same well near which the cloaked traveler had once camped before anyone knew her name, was said to run black for years afterward, and no animal would drink from it. Eda alone remained nearby, in a small cabin at the edge of the tree line, unable to fully leave the place that had taken everyone she loved. And it is said in the oldest tellings of this story that on certain autumn nights, when the fog refuses to lift, a woman in a cloak the color of dried blood can still be seen walking the tree line near where Asheville Hollow once stood. Not threatening, not vengeful, simply walking endlessly as though still searching for some village desperate enough to welcome her, and foolish enough to believe that salvation, when it arrives without a price already named, is ever truly free. Some say it is her ghost, cursed to wander for the lives her bargain cost. Others say it is something crueler still, that the Hollow Mother, having tasted the particular flavor of a village's faith and fear and greed all at once, simply learned to wear Maren's face better than Maren ever had, and walks now not in penance, but in hunger. Either way, the lesson the old folk of that region still pass down to their children is a simple one, repeated at firesides on nights much like this. Be wary of the healer who arrives exactly when your suffering begins. Be wary of the elder who profits quietly while you bleed loudly. And be most wary of all of your own desperate hope, because it is desperate hope, more than any witch or curse or hidden bargain, that so often opens the door through which the real darkness finally walks in. That is the story of Asheville Hollow, as it was told to me, and as I now pass it on to you,